Welcome to episode 7 of the report. Today is August 31st, and we're going to be discussing a plethora of things on tonight's edition of the report. We're starting off with the discussion of our changes to our race ratings, which pertains to our presidential, gubernatorial, senatorial, and House ratings. After that, we'll be discussing the remainder of our ratings with some maps. We have maps tonight, and we have Eric Cunningham, who's going to be coming on like he always does for our ratings, to discuss what he thinks is going on with these races, how the ratings are going to change potentially over the next few weeks, uh, and what it means for November. So we're going to be having that segment. We're also going to be having possibly, we don't know yet if it's going to be a debate or discussion. We're hoping we can get you your debate time, but we're debating over whether or not violence right now in the cities can be effectively connected to the Democrats to damage Joe Biden's campaign. And basically, even though Joe Biden's denounced the violence repeatedly in tweets, can Trump still effectively use it as a campaign message to damage Biden? Is effectively what we'll be debating tonight. And we have one person who's confirmed to be debating that, and that's Jared Stone. So we have that. And we're also going to be talking about polling in our middle segment for this presidential race, looking at how polling has evolved over the course of the race and making some predictions for polling going forward into November. Will the race tighten? Will it broaden back out? Are the trends we're seeing now going to pertain to the race as it goes forward or not? So we're going to be looking at that. But first, I'd like to welcome our guest we always bring on for our ratings discussions, Eric Cunningham, the lead editor and founder of Elections Daily. So welcome, Eric. Happy to have you on here on tonight's episode of the report.
Yep, happy to be here.
Yeah, so why don't we start off with what we typically do with the presidential ratings. So we'll talk about our changes to the presidential ratings. For the viewers, there were a few changes to our presidential ratings right now, and we actually have a pretty competitive map. Not a particularly large amount of electoral votes safe for any party, but we had the Michigan change, which moved back to leans Democratic. We initially had it as likely Democratic. And this is a state that Trump won in 2016, but he has been performing rather poorly in polls there, and he's stopped campaigning effectively when it comes to running ads there. If you look at recent data, he's actually spent more time targeting in terms of media and ads the state of Minnesota than he has in Michigan. At least that's what it appears, which is why our ratings tend to, at least to some extent, correspond with 538's model, which actually has Minnesota as a state that's more likely to go to Trump, even though Biden's still favored, than a state like Michigan is. But Eric, if you just want to discuss the change you made to your presidential ratings and why you made the change and what it means.
Yeah, so definitely. So the polls have definitely narrowed to a degree in Michigan to a point where we can't really say with confidence that it's likely Democratic. Out of all the states we have in the leans column right now, save for maybe New Hampshire, this would be the furthest one at the moment in terms of targets for Donald Trump. But his polling is improving there. Both sides seem to be taking it seriously at this point. There's been Republican internals there that seem to be really decent, and then Democrats, whether it's a turnout play or not, are insisting the races are also close there. A lot of them still kind of have nightmares from the 2016 election, where infamously he targeted the state heavily in the last week of the election or so, and it paid off. So this is more of an abundance of caution move. Obviously, if the polls continue to go one way or the other, we'll be shifting them. But with states like New Hampshire and Minnesota in here, I think it's a pretty reasonable change to shift this. Right, which leaves only one state in our likely column, which is Nevada. And this is primarily because there's been really a lack of polling in the state. It's a state that Democrats are favored to win, obviously, but there's not enough polling to say whether or not it's in the same league as those lean states at the moment, of which there are a good number. There's 4 states we have listed as leans Democratic right now, totaling 60 electoral votes. So a good amount of votes are still in that column.
And one thing to note about our presidential ratings before we move on to our congressional ratings, I mean, it was noted on our page by Kraz. He talked about some might question why we have states like Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina as toss-ups, while many Rust Belt states are leans Democratic. He said it has to do with a phenomenon we're starting to see where Democratic fortunes are declining rapidly in many of the elastic working class and Midwestern states, while making gains in some of these suburban Sunbelt states. And generally, most political analysts and pundits of any degree will agree that long-term the presidential coalitions appear to be shifting in a way that you'll have those more diverse Sunbelt states match with the Democratic Party's current coalition, whereas these traditionally Democratic bastions in the Rust Belt are continuing to trend towards the Republicans. Now, that doesn't mean they're not winnable for Democrats. Joe Biden is favored to win many of these
Mhm.
states, but in terms of a long-term trend, what do you think our ratings represent there?
Um, so at the moment, I think what it's telling is that those states that were in the what you'd call the blue wall, they're not snapping back purely into the Biden column like you would expect with a massive lead at the moment. They're polling pretty well, but they're polling pretty close to his national vote total. Whereas states like Texas and Georgia and even North Carolina to a degree are polling far behind where Biden is polling nationally, right? So that's a big difference here is, at the moment, I would say if this were to be a 5 point Biden win, I don't think states like Texas or Georgia or maybe even North Carolina flip. But states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan probably hold on. That's just kind of the indicate is that those Sunbelt states are shifting, but they're not doing it rocket speed like some of these Midwestern states where you saw votes that are double digit swings. The only state that's really seeming to kind of snap back to where it was is Maine. Maine was a competitive state in 2016. Kind of surprisingly, it was within 3 percentage points, and neither party is seriously targeting the entire state this cycle. Republicans are obviously hoping to salvage the congressional district there, but we have that listed as a toss-up, similar like the one in Nebraska. So even that's not a sure bet. That was already one that was that's the closest thing you would think of to like a toss-up state, right? It voted very similarly to states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, in terms of proportional to the vote, and then swung towards Trump. That's one where it has been a little bit more of a factor, but even then, it's not enough to put it back into the Democratic column at this point, which is that's just kind of the phenomenon we're looking at here, right? And obviously, we have states in the Republican column that are likely. We have a lot of likely Republican states. We have, Utah, Montana, Kansas, Missouri, and South Carolina. And we've talked about moving Indiana at some point if the polling in the fifth congressional district continues to be abysmal for Republicans. So it's not like we have some sort of inherent bias here. Just the matter of fact at the moment is states like Texas and Georgia seem like they're competitive right now, but more winnable than a state like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, something like that.
Hmm. It is certainly very interesting when we're looking at that factor. But could you briefly as well explain the changes to our Senate ratings and gubernatorial ratings before we move on to House ratings?
Yeah. So we made one change in the Senate ratings, and it's a change we talked about. This is more on the Kraz and Adam Trencher are the two that really handle these ratings, but we discuss all these internally to get an idea. And it was moving Minnesota. So we had the Minnesota Senate election at safe Democratic, and we moved it to likely. So basically, what that means is that we thought that Tina Smith would substantially outrun Biden. Obviously, we had Minnesota for a long time at likely Democratic. Um, but polling has come out and shown a fairly close race, even though Jason Lewis isn't the ideal candidate. He has won a competitive district in a national election before. There's various reasons we moved this, but basically it was, again, the polls are showing it closer than we expected, and it's at least a state that you could feasibly imagine Republicans winning in some sort of surprise scenario. It's
Yeah,
not one
and
the Democrats are completely locked into, like
yeah, and
like
Smith is still a
mhm,
favorite. Smith is still a favorite, and again, it's
yeah,
highly likely that Smith outruns Biden.
mhm,
Trump is likely going to perform better than Jason Lewis because even though Jason Lewis's district took in quite a few of the suburbs in that second district, there, he's
mhm,
definitely not someone that would be called popular in the suburbs. I mean, he only
yeah,
barely won in what was considered an
mhm,
upset in 2016, and then he lost his rematch reelection to Andrew Craig. He's definitely a
correct.
more caustic conservative, if you look at it that way, not someone who necessarily fits the bill of a more moderate suburban Republican that you'd see
Mhm,
in the Main Street coalition, for example. But yeah, I mean, it's a good point. And now he's running statewide. Um,
mhm,
I mean, it's also important to note that Housley, when she ran against Smith in the last election, still lost by 10 or 11 points. So
yeah.
Minnesota, even though it was close in the 2016 special election, still has a fairly predominant lean towards the Democrats,
Yeah, that was similar to
especially
how
at
it
the
voted
Senate
in
and gubernatorial
2014.
level.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm,
exactly. And I mean, when you have someone like Norm Coleman, who was the last Republican senator for the state, he lost by just a hair, only 300 votes or
mhm,
so back in 2008 to Al Franken. But I mean, you've had some close gubernatorial contests like 2014 when Mark Dayton was reelected. But still, I mean, it's worth looking at. Um, just the fact that Minnesota, even though it's trending towards the Republicans, had a close presidential race um, in 2016, and you have three districts there that are trending towards the Republicans.
Hmm.
Two of them that were held by Democrats, the 8th and the 1st, flipped in the 7th, which we're going to talk about later tonight. We also expect to flip now, but you also at the same time have districts like the 2nd and the 3rd, traditionally Republican, that have been moving towards Democrats. And that's at least, unless Jared debunks it in our later thing tonight, at least positive signs for Democrats in suburbs. But we're going to have a debate on that later tonight. So,
Yeah. And one other thing I wanted to mention with those Senate ratings is that at the moment we have it, if the ratings go exactly like we say they will, you'd have 49 Democrats, 48 Republicans, and three toss-up races. Obviously, in the event of a Biden presidency, you only need 50 votes because the vice president breaks ties. But if there's any indication historically, a 50-vote majority with the vice president is tenuous to say the least. So obviously, either party would prefer to get to 51 rather than to 50. And it's within reach for either because those three races are at the
mhm.
moment they're Iowa, they're Maine, and Montana would be those three races.
Yeah, and real quick, we're going to move on to our House races today. I'm in charge of the House ratings at Elections Daily, and we actually have three House ratings changes today: one in Michigan, one in Minnesota, and another in New Mexico. Two of the changes are moving towards the Democrats. One is moving towards the Republicans, and we're going to focus a lot tonight on Minnesota's 7th district, which we're moving towards the Republicans. Not only because Colin Peterson, the incumbent Democrat, is fairly prominent, but also because this is the first Democratic held seat that's been moved into the lean R column. We have now four open seats in Democratic columns for the Republicans. Georgia 7th is in the lean Democratic column. Texas 23, another open seat, is in the likely Democratic column. And the two open North Carolina seats are in the safe Democratic column because they've been redrawn in another set of mid-decade redistricting to be more Democratic. But this is notable because this is not only the first incumbent to be rated to lose, but the first Democratic incumbent to be rated to lose as well.
Mm-hmm.
So the other vulnerable incumbents are still in the toss-up category at this point, or in a lean category for their respective party.
Mm-hmm.
So the race this time is between Colin Peterson, who has represented the state in Congress since 1991. He was elected in 1990 following a string of close losses in the 80s there before he won the seat. And he had some close races early in his career. Then he really established himself and managed to win fairly easily for a long time. He didn't have another, somewhat competitive race until 2014, and he didn't even have a close race really until 2016. So there was a long gap between his race in '92, which was pretty close, and his race in say 2016 or 2018, which was so far the closest in decades for Peterson. And he's being challenged by arguably the best candidate he's ever been challenged by, Michelle Fischbach, who former Minnesota state senator and lieutenant governor of the state. Fischbach is actually a stronger fundraiser than Peterson. And it is true that Peterson does have the name recognition that you'd want to win a district that Clinton only got 30% in as a Democrat. And it's worked effectively, even though his margins have been coming down. But some are saying that the fact that he that he beat Dave Hughes by a smaller margin in 2018 than he did in 2016 is a bad sign for him this time because Fischbach is widely considered by Republicans to be a much better candidate than someone like Dave Hughes. And the fact that Trump is expected to win this district by either the same amount or slightly less than he did last time should be enough to potentially put the end to Peterson's career. And he is the chair of the House Agricultural Committee, and he is genuinely considered one of the most vulnerable Democrats right now, and definitely the most senior vulnerable Democrat at the moment. So it's definitely going to be a very interesting race. Just to show you Peterson's history of crossover appeal, and we're going to see crossover appeal this time. If Peterson loses, it'll likely be by a very narrow amount to Fischbach. We do not expect Fischbach right now, even though we now consider her a favorite to win by a large amount. But Trump will significantly outrun Fischbach, or if you want to reverse that analogy, Biden will significantly underperform Peterson just as Clinton did. But here is a map right here that I made earlier today of Minnesota 7, comparing the 2018 House results in the 7th, where Peterson had for a Colin Peterson race, a fairly close race against Dave Hughes. You can see there tons of crossover appeals. Still a close race. still around the same margin as 2016, which is kind of ominous considering it was a big blue wave in 2018, and Minnesota's other two seats, districts 1 and 8, which were open seats, flipped. And obviously, Trump won this district by a commanding margin. So that's another aspect of it. But this was a tough decision because Peterson is still a formidable incumbent. He's someone who we consider a strong incumbent, but it's going to be his toughest race this year. And even though you can expect to see a lot of this crossover appeal that you saw between 2016 and 2018, or even 2016 and 2016, it's certainly going to be a very, very interesting election when we look at it that way. And Eric, I don't know if you have anything you want to say about
Mhm.
this election in particular, but it's going to be, it's definitely one of, in my opinion, the most interesting House races this cycle, just given the fact that Peterson is such a prominent member of the Democratic caucus and also so very vulnerable. I mean, he's one of the last people to represent a district that leans so far to the opposite of his political party.
Yeah, and he's also kind of the last of his kind in terms of socially conservative Democrats. On specifically, he's pro-life. Has specific. I mean, obviously, that's part of representing a district that's so Republican. Even I mean, it's more Republican than it used to be. This is only a Romney +9 seat, and it turned into a Trump +30 seat. So obviously, there's been a little bit of a transformation there recently. But it's not him being the chair of the Agriculture Committee. I mean, that's a pretty major decline. The people next up in seniority in that committee aren't in rural districts. He's basically the last link the
Except
Democratic
Costa
Party
is
has
really the
there.
only one who's in a somewhat rural district.
Yeah, but like out of those that are left, I mean, yeah, Costa, obviously, although his seat represents more Fresno specifically, and that may be redrawn in the next cycle, given how unusual it looks at the moment. But like David Scott, Marcia Fudge, Jim McGovern, these people don't represent the sort of district that historically runs the Agriculture Committee. So he's really his last tie to that sort of Midwestern thing there. I mean, obviously, Democrats could decide to alter things and to modify their committee placements, but generally seniority rules. So this would be a pretty big decline. I mean, a pretty big defeat for Democrats because obviously they lost committee chairs left and right this cycle in primaries. On the Democratic side, losing one into general as well, like this, would probably not be a great thing, I wouldn't think. And obviously, Fishbach is a really good candidate. She's known. She's out fundraising him. She has a lot of tangible advantages, and just as a whole, it seems to be a pretty good situation for her so far. Obviously, the election is still yet to come, and things may change, but it's just a really difficult situation for him to get out of. I mean,
Yeah, it does appear his time might be up. And Fishbach has been a competitive fundraiser, but it's also important to note that, just to clarify, Fishbach has technically outraised Peterson, but according to but Peterson has more cash on hand
yeah.
at the moment. So I
Hmm.
just want to clarify that to our viewers that even though they're competitive in total receipts, Fishbach has spent a lot more money on advertising so far attacking Peterson, which is part of the reason why Peterson has more cash on hand. So just don't be confused about that if you go on the
Yeah.
FEC website.
It's a tricky thing. It's a tricky thing to look at, but obviously, defining him and trying to position him that he's not the moderate Democrat he asserts himself to be, kind of the last
No,
of the
and,
old
and
guard of
even
the Blue Dogs. Um,
and even with, I mean, yeah, he really is in a way a remnant of the old Blue Dog caucus because traditionally the Blue Dogs were rural conservative Democrats in districts like these in the South and the Rust
mhm,
Belt and North, etc. Now the Blue Dogs are really becoming more of the suburban moderate
mhm.
party
The
kind of a
Stephanie
thing.
Murphy, the
I
Stephanie
mean,
Murphys,
and you have
the
to look at it.
fiscally conservative, socially liberal, as opposed to socially
Yeah,
conservative, fiscally liberal.
yeah, and you see some of this. You see some of this. All you. You try not to sneeze. You see some of this on. I lost my train of thought. I was trying not to sneeze, but because you can't do that anymore with coronavirus. So
Ah,
what I was trying to say was, yes, Peterson is definitely a remnant of more what the Blue Dogs were rather than what they are now. Because if you look at the Blue Dog Caucus now, again, you've got many more people that would be in suburban districts,
mhm.
and not always suburban, but districts that even if they have rural areas in it, like Brindisi's district has a lot of rural areas in it, but at the same time, it does have suburbs in it as well.
Yeah,
Places around Binghamton and to the southeast of Syracuse as well. Yeah,
yeah.
and I like our comment from Jackson in the comments that Blue Dog doesn't mean what it means anymore, because someone like Stephanie Murphy, I would agree, is honestly closer to like the New Democrats caucus, because the modern definition of conservative Democrat is not what it was back in the 90s or early 2000s.
She's more, I mean, obviously the New Democrat caucus has basically just become kind of what the Republican Study Committee is, which is just generic Democrat caucus, where it used to actually be, it actually stood for fiscally moderate, conservative, socially liberal. Obviously, people like Stephanie Murphy are trying to push harder for the Chamber of Commerce endorsements and things like that. But if he goes down, that's really the line. I mean, there's not anyone, maybe Kurt Schrader maybe would be like kind of those last links, but Jim Costa, but there's really not a whole lot of those types left. They all got routed in 2010, 2012, 2014. So this should kind of be a historic moment if Republicans manage to flip the seat.
Mm-hmm. It would be. It would be a historic moment. It would be a change if you look at it that way. I mean, if Peterson loses, uh, the House is going to be without someone who, for better or for worse, has been there for a long time and become quite an influential figure. And when
Mm-hmm.
Peterson started running for Congress back in the 80s, he had quite a string of losses back then before he actually won the seat. And frankly, people didn't really think he would amount to anything. And now he's amounted to become one of the most predominant Democrats. And even though this was more common before the 2010 midterms, where you used to have Democrats representing seats that voted for McCain by strong margins,
Mm-hmm.
Peterson's really the last example. And I'm not talking about a Democrat representing a Trump plus 5 or Trump plus 10 seat. I'm talking about a Democrat representing
Trump
a
plus
seat Trump
30.
won by 30 points. That's something you don't see anymore. There are no more
Yeah.
people like Rick Boucher, Ike Skelton, Gene Taylor. Those people, you don't. Most of them were wiped out back in 2010. The few that held on lost re-election in 2014. So it's
Mm-hmm.
definitely going to be really interesting to see, because if Peterson can hold on now, it's almost certain he retires in 2022 because his seat's going to be broken up in redistricting. And we'll probably cover this on redistricting radar, because Minnesota's likely to lose the seat. But again, just to see the map, this is his traditional crossover appeal. Even if you don't know anything about politics, you should be able to tell that this man is pretty talented, at least historically, of getting crossover support. But for the reasons we've mentioned before, especially Fishbach being a competitive fundraiser, Fishbach being a better candidate overall than someone like Dave Hughes, um,
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that Peterson's margin technically went down between 2018 and 2016, even though 2018 was a much better year than 2016. And we've seen maps of this all the time. How in the 2014 red wave, you had the 8th district of Minnesota and the eighth district voting for the governorship, and that's the other district in Minnesota in the Iron Range, and they voted Democratic in the red wave in 2014. But then they both flipped in 2018 in a blue wave. So that just shows you trend, basically.
Mm-hmm. And Dave Hughes was not a good candidate.
No, he was
He
not.
wasn't supported nationally. He was basically kind of left for dead. And kind of, so I mean, the fact that
It
Republicans were
shows you how
seriously
red
contesting it
this
this time is a
field
big
is,
deal.
and that's why we've moved it to lean Republican. And there are a few more seats that we could see potentially moving to lean Republican
Mm-hmm.
eventually, particularly Brindisi's seat, the 5th district. Maybe at the moment, I really see South Carolina 1 as staying as a toss-up, but it is possible that Mace uh, takes that seat. And some seats we might move to lean Democratic. Candace Valenzuela's race in the open seat in Texas 24 could end up as the lean Dem as well. But again, overall, if you look at our House ratings, these are our House ratings right now, if you can see that. These are the changes we made today. We're going to get to the other two changes shortly. We moved Michigan 6 from likely R to lean R. John Hoadley's challenging Fred Upton there, and it's generally considered to be a close race despite the scandal that came out earlier about John Hoadley supposedly blogging about sex and drugs while he was
Mm-hmm.
younger. And we also have a race we're going to explain with a map in New Mexico, too, where we moved Torres' small seat from toss-up to lean Democrat. That's a Trump plus 10 seat, but it's going to be interesting to see how Biden does now without the Gary Johnson variable, because you still had a lot of third-party support in New Mexico, too, to the same degree that you had third-party support
Mm-hmm.
in a seat like Utah 4. So you don't really know. Will Biden carry it? We'll see. And looking at this is our total composition of the House right now. We have 14 toss-ups. But at the moment, Democrats are still heavily favored to hold their House majority. So it's looking
Mm-hmm.
like a year without a particularly large amount of change for incumbents in
Yeah,
terms of
even if
incumbents.
Republicans win every single one of their toss-ups, those toss-ups, they'd still be in a pretty solid minority there.
Yeah. So real quick, we're going to look at our map in New Mexico. So this is New Mexico 2 in 2018. Uh, Torres Small managed to narrowly flip the open seat of Republican Steve Pierce, who retired to run for governor that year. It was an incredibly close race. It was very, very close against Harrell, but it's actually a rematch this time. And we're going to discuss it. Um, we're going to discuss it because we have this as lean Democratic now instead of a toss up. So it was one of the closest races in 2018. Harrell was actually up on election night, and Small narrowly took the lead overall. So, uh, Eric, do you want to say anything about this seat real quick?
Yeah, so Yvette Herrell is honestly a pretty bad candidate. Obviously, having someone who lost last time running again is not great, but Republicans had a candidate they liked in Claire Chase, who would probably be better positioned in the general. But Torres Small has a pretty decent base. It is New Mexico, so there's a lot of voters who are willing to split tickets. It's a majority Hispanic seat if you look at the voter composition. So it's a very diverse region, like a lot of New Mexico in general. And it's been known to split tickets before. It split tickets in 2008, obviously in 2018. So obviously
Yeah,
it's a good it's Democrats got their chosen opponent here basically, and Republicans really going to have a hard time with her because she's just honestly not a very good candidate.
yeah, and the district used to be represented by a Democrat named Harry Teague, who held it for one term from 2008 to the lost
Hmm.
reelection in 2010 to Steve Pierce. But Harry Teague was a different type of Democrat from Social Torres
Yeah,
Small for sure.
yeah. I mean, there's
He was the
rumors he
blue
may have
dog
actually.
Democrat.
Yeah.
He was one of the last Democrats without a
Hmm.
college degree in Congress. He was fairly conservative, and he lost reelection by 10 points to Steve Pierce, but he had that one victory in 2008.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the old type of Democrat, whereas Torres Small is definitely a different sort of candidate. But again, it's New Mexico does like to split tickets. It wouldn't be a shock if Harrell wins here, but given her track record, it's just it's harder to see that scenario, especially given Republicans aren't actually contesting New Mexico like they were touting for so long at this point.
Yeah, and if we look at the seat, I mean, Harrell's been controversial as a candidate, and many people are arguing, as we are, that Torres Small is a strong incumbent, a strong fundraiser, someone who should be able to win this time. We have it at lean Democratic. There are
Hmm.
probably going to be some Trump Small voters. I mean, that's something we can guess if we look at this election. I mean, we don't know
Hmm.
for sure how many, but it's something that will play a factor. It'll be a role in this election.
Hmm.
But Small is favored to win re-election in this rematch, and there were some scandals in the primary when Harrell was against Chase in the primary there about how devoted she actually was to Trump. Now, that may work in a Republican primary, and those attacks will probably not work to the same degree in a general election, especially in a competitive seat like this. But it is very, very interesting to look at Torres Small as kind of that new kind of Democrat from the Southwest. And it'll be interesting to see how the seat votes on the presidential level with an absence of major third party votes.
Hmm. Yeah. And she also had some campaign finance problems in 2018. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why she's not an ideal candidate, just overall.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
So we finished up our rating sections, but I believe Eric's going to stay on for the section about polling, which we're going to talk about until it looks like our discussion. We're not, I don't know if we're going to be able to do a debate time this week because we haven't found someone to debate against Jared. So we might just have Jared on and have a discussion with him. But before that, we're going to be talking about polling, and I have 538 up to look at the latest polling in the
Hmm.
presidential race. And I'm basically going to get Eric's opinion for the next 15 minutes on whether or not he thinks the race is tightening and whether he thinks that the polls over the next month will follow the last few polls that have been much closer than polls from last month, for example, or whether he thinks Biden will be manage to rebuild his lead a little bit. So, what do
Hmm.
you think recently about the recent polls you've seen, Eric?
There doesn't seem to have been a huge convention bump, if anything, but also a lot of these polls aren't really gold standard. They're places like Emerson or Trafalgar. Just like honestly, I wouldn't draw too much from the polls that are coming up right now. I really want to see what places like what some more reliable firms are showing, basically. Because last time there was actually a substantial bump during the RNC. Trump went from losing, from behind by 1 point to Hillary to being ahead by 4. If you look at some of the polling, I think it was the Morning Consult poll after the convention. So there was a bump. Whereas this time, if you look at what's been going on in the polling right now, it doesn't seem like there's a substantial bump like that. If there is, it's making a fairly sizable deficit smaller. I think morning consult showed that Biden's favorability took a little bit of a hit, but it wasn't like Trump did. He didn't gain at all. It was basically just Biden lost a couple points in favorability.
Yeah, Trump went up in the consult poll. I mean, Biden fell by 2 points or so,
Yeah.
2 or 3, and Trump went up like around 1 point. So but the
Hmm.
sample size for that morning consult poll was fairly high, which makes the margin of error lower.
Yeah.
And morning consult and YouGov are both B-rated pollsters, and they both had Biden up by around 6 points, which does mean the race. And I believe the race is
Hmm.
narrower to an extent than it was last month. But I
Hmm.
still believe Biden's the favorite. If you look at the polling, I mean, even 538's model, it definitely is not where it was last month. It's only at 68, 69% chance of victory now. That's not Biden as a commanding, unquestioned favorite, but Biden still is a pretty firm favorite. Like at this point,
Hmm.
it'll be interesting because we have had some polls from mediocre pollsters that showed Biden up by more, or that showed Biden up in the case of that Trafalgar poll down, or Biden down in that Trafalgar poll. But I mean, those were the last two really high quality polls. I mean, people don't really like Emerson's crosstabs, but they do still get an A rating on 538, and they showed Biden up by only 3, which
Yeah.
was the narrowest margin there. But even if
Yeah.
you account for the fact,
I know people like to call them memerson, but they do have some credibility in the field. I mean, it's not easy to get
I
an
mean,
A
technically
from
they're
from
rated
538.
more. Technically, they have a higher rating than Morning Consult and YouGov. I mean,
Yeah.
they're the only A-rated pollster, and they only had Biden up by 3 points. So it's interesting.
Hmm. Yeah. For me, I also want to see more state polling. Obviously, Trafalgar put out a poll of Missouri today, which only had Donald Trump up by 11, which is concerning. Obviously, we have the state at likely Republican because there have been other polls like this that have shown some closer races. But on the other hand, they put polls out in other states that have shown relatively closer races. I know public policy polling did a poll last week that looked at Alaska that didn't include presidential crosstabs, which kind of made me a little bit angry because I wanted to see what the presidential polling was there, especially given they have a history of polling Alaska. So I really want to see how some of these state ones go because obviously, if he's starting to pull closer in states like Minnesota, where his polling has improved recently, other states like New Hampshire, Nevada would be great to have polls because there's not really been any high quality polls of those states, and they're pretty important swing states. They're only 4 6 electoral votes, but they're still pretty valuable overall. Um, so really,
Yeah, I mean,
that's just what I've been seeing so far.
there was the David Binder research poll that had Biden up by 18 in Minnesota, which was obviously ridiculous.
Yeah.
Um, and then you had PPP, which has a slight Democratic bias, but generally a good record that had Biden up 10. You had Emerson, and generally that's considered to lean towards the Republicans, at least recently. That only had Biden up by 2. So, what I like to do in an instance like this is kind of take all the polls together and merge them, average them out, and then you kind of get a Biden plus
Hmm.
4, Biden plus 5 in Minnesota, which is competitive still
Yeah,
and
especially
interesting.
given the
I mean,
state
there
of the
was also a
national race.
Trafalgar poll. Trafalgar poll had them tied there, but that also had
Hmm.
Jorgensen getting 4%, which would be quite a lot.
And obviously, Trafalgar has a problem with their polling, or they apparently did this in 2016, but they have this weird. They weigh races by social desirability, which basically means Trump is a less desirable candidate, so they give him free points. Obviously, some people have taken issue with that because that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense as methodology goes. But apparently, they did this in 2016 as well. At least that's what they're saying. It probably didn't work in 2018, given their polling was substantially off in that election. Um,
Mhm.
but there's a reason Trafalgar specifically has kind of had a bad reputation among some users on election Twitter, to put it mildly.
Yeah, and when we look at those polls so far, I mean, Minnesota is technically, if you look at the 538 model, which basically is an amalgamation of all the polls, Minnesota is technically closer than Michigan at this
Mhm.
point. It's going to be
Yeah.
really, really interesting to see if Minnesota this election votes to the right of Michigan.
Hmm. That'd be pretty wild.
And
I
what do
mean,
you think about the chances of that, in your
I don't.
opinion?
Yeah, I don't think it's entirely impossible that Trump wins Minnesota while losing Arizona. At least if you look at the current polling, if the race were to narrow, there are some just unique reasons in
Yeah, and
general why Minnesota is a viable target. Actually, it's very similar to Arizona in that it's a state where Republicans in Minnesota have been stuck at 45% for a while, and Democrats in Arizona have been stuck at 45% for a while. But in both of those states, 2016 kind of showed a bit of a breakthrough where obviously Minnesota was very close. It voted a little bit to the right of the nation if you look at the popular vote. And Arizona, Trump only won 48% of the vote there. It's really not
Yeah, I
impossible
mean,
you see something
even
like
a
that.
swing state like Wisconsin,
Hmm.
critical to Trump's victory, a state that Clinton did not campaign in at all after the convention, after the primaries in 2016, a
Hmm.
state where Biden does have a lead right now. But even then, if the race tightens, you've had people who have been polled on election Twitter and said that they view Arizona as um, more winnable for the Biden campaign than a state like Wisconsin is.
Which I would say that's a little bit. I don't want to say it's ridiculous, but I think Wisconsin is clearly the marquee swing state of
No, no,
American
no. I'm
politics at
not
this point.
saying I
Yeah,
personally agree with it, and the polling wouldn't back that up, but that is what I've heard some people say. And
yeah.
I think it could be in 2024 more of a true analogy as the Rust Belt continues to trend away from the Democrats and the Sun
Like
Belt
I think it's
trend
I think
slowly.
it's entirely possible that Minnesota votes to the right of not only Michigan but also Pennsylvania, mainly because those states have far more suburbs that can flip, whereas Minnesota has so much red that's not even come close to reaching its full potential. And it's mainly relying on flipping some suburban areas, which already lean Democratic to begin with. I mean, there's really not a whole lot more you can get out of Hennepin County or Ramsey, whereas there's a lot more you can get out of the wide open rural areas that have still been hesitant to switch parties. Again, this is all hypothetical. Right now, as the race goes, I wouldn't expect Trump to win Minnesota. I wouldn't actually expect him to win any of the states we haven't leaned Democratic, and I would expect him to lose some of the states we have in toss-up. He could win the presidential election at the moment. I believe we have it where uh, if Biden just wins the states that are safe, likely, and leans, he has the election very narrowly. So he wouldn't theoretically need any of the toss-up states. That could
Mhm.
change in the future if the polls narrow. Obviously, states are going to be pretty important to look at. Um, what I want to see is I want to see North Carolina. I think North Carolina suffered from a lot of polling, but not all of it's been great. Um, I think I really want to see some more voting or some more polls in that state. Also in Georgia, I know there was a poll from Public Policy that put Biden up by one. Obviously, they're a Democratic pollster, so that does imply some bias there. But Texas as well. Basically, the we've kind of had a glut of polling. We've not had a whole lot.
There was an ECU poll in North Carolina that had
Mhm.
it tied, and then there was a morning
Yeah,
consult poll on Biden at 3. So
yeah.
basically, it
Morning
shows a
console. There
clear
was a
toss-up
Civitas
state.
poll. Yeah, there's a Civitas poll. Public Policy is polled, obviously. Um, but I think I don't know. There's been a lot of states where you could say I wish we had more polling out of them this cycle, and I really hope people start paying more attention to this now because really the campaign is underfoot now. I mean, obviously, we're kind of unusual among countries. I was listening to a YouTuber who mentioned that Americans are considered to have really long presidential election cycles. But if you count it from the convention, which is basically what every other country on earth does, basically if you count it to where the candidates are nominated, it's a similar amount of time to any other country on earth has. So we're in full campaign swing. We know what the issues are going to be. We know what the topics are going to be. We know what the focuses are going to be coming out of the conventions. So do some more polling on this in all the swing states and kind of get us an idea of if there's been any boost at all. I assume people out there doing that, um, but at the moment, I've just not been impressed with the post convention polling, to put it lightly.
Mhm. And another thing to do with polls that I want to talk about is polls also conducted by Emerson, which is generally a reliable pollster. If you look at their rating, I wouldn't say reliable in their 2018 polls because most of those were not very
Sure.
good. But in terms of just getting an A minus rating, sure. So it's interesting to look at. They polled November voting plan and candidate support over the last 2 days. Um, whether the people would be voting for Trump or Biden based off of how they're voting. And you had vote in person early, where Trump leads 50 to 48. Vote in person on election day, Trump leads 57 to 37. But then vote by mail, heavily lopsided, Biden leads 67 to 28.
Hmm.
And
That's going
what's
to
your
be
general
interesting.
opinion on that?
I think states are going to have to really take the vote by mail seriously. I know in Pennsylvania, I believe, is that Governor Tom Wolf has said they're going to start counting ballots ahead of election day. so that they can
Yeah,
get
they're
the results
supposed
out.
to have all their ballots counted 21 days before election day.
Mhm. This is
They
something
turned
I know.
it off.
Yeah, I know Joe Szymanski was a big fan of this move. I think Republicans are going to be happy with it because just for the look of things, it's much better to have all those votes counted, have the election day come in, and then know who won, rather than have those votes trickle in over a week and have the appearance
Which is
of.
what most of the states are going to be doing.
Mhm. Yeah. Now, granted, some of them had no problems. Texas didn't have a whole lot of problems with their.
No, Texas doesn't. And Florida
Yeah.
was pretty good about it as well.
Yeah, Florida's always pretty good. Aside from Florida gets a bad rep, but really that's Palm Beach and Broward just screwing the pooch. Those two
And
counties.
that's basically what happened in the 2000 presidential race and the 2018
Yeah,
Senate race. So,
yeah. Like literally, the rest of Florida is awesome. One of our contributors, Jenya Coulter, I believe if she doesn't work there as a as a poll worker, she does, or she had in the past. They do a good job. They're not incompetent. It's just Broward and Palm Beach in particular have incompetent teams at points.
I mean, it's interesting. It is interesting, as I always say on this show, to look at the nuances you'll see within a state, not just within the country as a whole, but within a state, how you'll see nuances in how they count ballots effectively. And
Yeah.
Florida is a great example of that. I mean, if you look at the 2000 presidential race, Palm Beach County, if you look at the 2018 Senate race, Broward County, Brenda Snipes, very close race where incumbent Democrat Bill Nelson ended up losing in a fluke race in a blue wave by just 0.1%. 0.1. Really, really narrow margin
Well,
to Rick
again,
Scott, who,
yeah,
who Rick Scott continues to win races by ever smaller margins each time,
yeah.
narrower and
This is
narrower. I
why
mean, we've got to assume in 2024 he'll be reelected by one vote.
this is why I created the infamous Rick Scott Thanos meme, because he is inevitable. He's going to win by like 5 votes, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. It's
Pretty
just
much. I mean, he's the perfect personification of Florida's small but decisive Republican lean in recent years.
yeah. But yeah, overall, like that's gonna be a big one. I really want to see how some of the states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and Iowa count their votes. Obviously, those states may have substantial amounts of mail-in votes, and states like Michigan and Ohio, in particular, are very large states. They're within the top 10, if I recall right, of state population nationally. I
Mhm.
am really skeptical about California and New York. I think California, in particular, is going to be worse than ever.
California
Honestly,
could be still counting into like December at this rate. If you look at how
which is
slow
just
they were in
absurd.
2018.
Yeah, which they stretch again. There are entire countries with larger populations than California that count their votes in a night. It's really that's just their laws that uniquely make them problematic in that regard, I would say. But thankfully, states like California and New York are not going to be deciding the election. So hopefully, the rest of the ones follow that Pennsylvania path and have them counted ahead of time, or they just follow, Texas and Florida and don't have that problem.
Mhm. Yeah, so we're about to get into our next segment with a debate here in 1 minute. So it won't really be a debate. But Eric, you're welcome to stay on for this if you want to provide some extra commentary as well, because I know
Sure.
all three of us, I think, agree on this point.
Yeah.
But we're basically going to be debating, can Trump effectively use his attacks against Biden? And Biden has denounced on Twitter repeatedly and in person the violence going on in the cities right now. But how effective will it be as a campaign attack for Donald Trump to effectively connect the violence that's going on in places like Kenosha, Wisconsin, and other cities we've seen this year to Biden's campaign? And what impact will that have on Biden's ability to win the election? And by extension, what impact will that have on suburbs that have otherwise been trending towards the Democrats, but now potentially, given these issues going on, could Trump effectively scare suburban voters away from Democrats? And even if it's not enough this time, could it really play an impact in the 2022 midterms if it's already a good environment for Republicans? So we're going to be welcoming Jared Stone on. Welcome, Jared. It's going
Hi,
to be
guys.
Welcome.
there would have been a traditional debate time this week, but unfortunately it didn't work out. So I'm just going to have Jared go through his argument. Essentially, I know he's arguing that it will damage Biden and down ballot Democrats. But if you want to just go through your argument, Jared, real quick.
Yeah, and first, let me say, for the sake of keeping this conversation interesting, hopefully, I can bring up some counterpoints that I think
Mhm.
do have some weight to them, even if I don't agree with them. But my opinion is that what we're seeing is that the backlash to these riots, at least the popular perception of what these riots bring to the forefront of our society, is going to help Trump in his narrative and in his argument to help him basically win back the White House. Now, I'm not saying that he is favored by any means. If any polling recently is an indication of what the current state is, Joe Biden has a very strong advantage, pretty much Obama 2008 levels. Now, it's kind of incomparable to say that his victory is going to be like Obama's in 2008 because those coalitions have changed. And I think this really plays into the topic really well. It's a very salient point because I think what Trump is trying to capitalize on is this sort of law and order type of sentiment that has traditionally been seen throughout a lot of predominantly Caucasian suburbs in major cities. These include cities like New York, Los Angeles, Houston, Chicago. And so when our country has seen points where people have engaged in looting and rioting, and things have really gone to the brink of destruction, an example is 1968, where you had two different factions of the Democratic Party, namely sort of the Hubert Humphrey, more establishment Johnsonian type, which advocated for a strong military presence in Vietnam, even still. And then sort of the hippie revolutionary counterculture, which advised against it. You saw these clashes and you saw a lot of violence break out in cities. You know, the assassination of prominent political leaders like Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. But contextually speaking, the result from that was a win for Republicans. They were able to quite successfully round up voters in the suburbs who were quite uncomfortable with some of the new sentiments that were being felt across the country. And so the law and order type of suburban sentiment was something that was really encapsulated by that moment in history. But I don't think that that's something that is true today, just because we're seeing that a lot of the suburbs that have traditionally adhered to this sentiment are now much more diverse and also much more socially liberal, meaning that they may not resonate with this type of language as much as people 50 years ago would have who have been living in those areas. With that said, I was trying to say that as sort of a point there, but you are seeing a considerable shift in public opinion away from supporting these riots, which are sort of brought about by a greater international or a greater national reckoning on race with the Black Lives Matter movement. But you are seeing some backlash against it just because some of these violent ramifications have started to hit home more for people, especially people in places like Kenosha in Wisconsin, and previously in places like Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington. And you see a few prevailing political factors here. Basically, these cities are predominantly Democratic. They are run by Democrats on almost every echelon of government. They are also governed by a Democratic mayor. The states of Oregon, Washington, and Wisconsin all have Democratic governors, rather. And so almost all tiers of government there are controlled by Democrats. And so that is juxtaposed with the national situation where Donald Trump is trying to get the National Guard to come into these areas. And you're seeing some clashes between the Democratic administration, the people who oversee these places, versus the Republican president. I think that people are starting to get sick in some of these areas of the rioting and of the destruction that has been incurred as a result of this national reckoning on race. And I think that people are starting to become, therefore, more in favor of the presidential tone, which has been much more, again, law and order, trying to restore order and basic safety in these places via things like the National Guard.
And it's, in my opinion, it's probably the perfect thing for Trump to run on when he really doesn't have very much else to run on this election, because the stock market is very, very good right now. And that is a good representation of pent up business energy that's just waiting to bust out and revive the economy. But other economic indicators largely aren't very good. GDP is not very good. Unemployment has been stagnating. And, general economic outlook by the poorer half of the country has also not been very good in terms of jobs. More people have filed for unemployment. So it's a mixed bag. Trump's definitely not running on the economy in the same way he did in 2016. And he disagrees with his Democratic opponents on the virus because they're arguing that he's botched his response to the virus. Trump's arguing that the virus is essentially the reason why the economy is not doing well right now. And essentially, that is a fair point. I mean, the economy would, I'm almost certain, be doing fairly well right now if it weren't for the virus. I mean, people were predicting a recession just because you naturally have recessions every 8 to 10 years, but not to this scale. The virus is certainly an extraordinary circumstance. So just to revert back, that pretty much leaves Trump running for re-election genuinely with more things that he could be attacked on rather than to attack his opponent on with the riots. as a perfect way to attack Biden. And Republican strategists have clearly realized this because they try to incorporate more people of minority origin into their RNC, first of all. And that was a genuine attempt, in my opinion, to make the Republican Party at least appear more diverse on that level. For better or for worse, they're definitely going to have an easier chance at winning over some Hispanic voters and Cuban voters than they are African American voters. But they attempted it, and I think that's their strategy long term. Is even if there's still kind of this Trump brand that's even if there's kind of this Trump brand that's mixing in with the Republican Party, and there's a good chance that that Trump populism will always at least have a faction, even if it's not the dominating faction within the Republican Party. But I think the convention showed a chance where the Republicans were trying to make themselves more diverse because they know that as some of these states, particularly along the Sun Belt, become more diverse, that would be necessary for a winning coalition. And I know, just real quick before I get back to my final point, I know that Peter, when he was on Elections Weekly last Thursday, even said that he expects there to be at least a woman or someone of minority origin like Tim Scott to be on the Republican ticket in 2024 in some capacity, which will be very, very interesting. I know a lot of Democrats disagree with that, but I think Republicans are going to realize that they have to become a more diverse party to win presidential elections long term. But back to my points, Trump's in a hostile environment right now as an incumbent. He's still not a favorite, even though the polls have been slightly narrower than they were last month. And if you look at this, it's almost a perfect way to attack a Democratic candidate. Because if you look at President Trump at the place he's sitting right now, he can just blame Democratic governors and mayors. And this is not even what I'm saying. I mean, it's just a fact. He can blame Democratic governors and mayors of some of these cities. He can use the convention. He can use Fox News and other conservative outlets to spread images of these riots and what's going on. And he can effectively say that it's not his fault that they aren't being stopped, but that since the people like Oregon Governor Kate Brown just straight out don't want the National Guard to suppress the rioting, he can just use that to rally up support around him and blame the Democrats. And thus, even though Joe Biden has said on Twitter quite a few times today that he doesn't support the riots, he can implicitly connect Joe Biden to the riots, which is effectively one of the few things President Trump has going for him in an otherwise fairly grim year for him for re-election. And Eric, I don't know if there's anything you want to say about it, but it really is, in my opinion, one of the best things that Trump can run on to win back suburbs. Even if we don't know if it's going to be successful or not, but if I were a Republican strategist, that's probably what I would tell Trump to run on at this point, because it's one of the few things that would potentially benefit the GOP.
Yeah. So realistically, I think he actually has a couple of advantages here. First off is that these riots are primarily happening in swing states. They're happening in Minnesota and in Michigan or in Wisconsin, which is obviously those are two major swing states. Kenosha County actually voted for the county that said, I believe Racine County voted for Donald Trump in 2016, the first time it had voted for a Republican in decades. So obviously there's a little bit of pent up stuff there. Another thing is that they actually have ammo to go on. Kamala Harris, during the initial unrest in Minnesota, was promoting the bail fund for rioters, which is ultimately what it was, is that resulted in rioters going out on the streets. If you're ever going to have a promotion for kind of the Willie Horton sort of ad, that's the way you do that, is you find someone who was the victim of crime from one of those people who were released. There's genuinely stuff that can. Another one specifically is that obviously states like I think Minnesota is one where he could especially benefit from this, because obviously the suburban decline there has been a big deal. If you could combine increasing Republican strength in the rural areas of Minnesota with at least a little bit of a pushback in the suburban front, that's all of a sudden takes a state that probably would vote for Biden and brings it much more closer to the forefront, specifically.
If Trump was managed to revive Lee Atwater, he would actually potentially win the election. I mean, as you know, for better or for worse, whether you disagree with Lee Atwater's tactics of race baiting and pointing out crime and why it was bad and associated with Democrats, that's not my words, those are his words, but it worked effectively to, along with other factors, to turn around what was a Dukakis lead in the polls for almost the entire portion, except for the late half of the 1988 campaign, into a Bush re-election win by a stable margin in the popular vote and a landslide margin in the electoral vote. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I'm saying I think we all agree that if things continue as they are, and Trump uses this as his one method, that Biden is still the favorite, but that it's definitely hurting Biden more than it's necessarily helping Trump, and that's probably why we've seen Biden get his support chipped away in the polls more than we've seen Trump rise in the polls. But if someone's support's being chipped away, it could lead to a narrower Biden victory than we would have expected last month. I mean, is that something you guys think is a possibility, in your opinion?
Sure.
What about you, Jared?
Absolutely. I think that a state like Minnesota, even though it did vote for Democrats by overwhelming margins in 2018, notably Amy Klobuchar is able to win all of the congressional districts there, albeit them narrowly. But this could definitely be a tactic that could turn an otherwise insurmountable lead for Biden into a barn burner of a race. And so it's something to not be taken for granted. And I think that one more point I have on this is that I think this is a perfect tactic for Trump, mainly because it doesn't really rest on ideology. If Trump is putting all the resources out there and they're simply being refused by the Democrats who oversee these states, whether on the state or on the local level, then he doesn't need to rest on any sort of ideology or to resort to it. All he has to do is to acknowledge the fact that he is presenting those resources to help out the situation. And so for someone who is not as driven by ideology as many other Republicans have been historically, I think this really fits sort of the Trump character quite well.
Yeah, and if Trump brings this to the presidential debates, and there are going to be 3 of them, and Biden and Trump have already agreed to them, and I'm looking forward to them. So I can guarantee you there are going to be questions about this in the debate, and I feel like Trump, there's going to be a large national audience because the conservatives are arguing that Biden's not fit to be president. So you're going to have a lot of people tuning into the debate to see whether Biden actually debates Trump well or whether he collapses against Trump. And he debated fine in the Democratic primaries, and there really isn't any evidence that his mental acuity is going down to the point where he can't serve as president. But when we're looking at this on the baseline level, I'm very interested to see how much Trump stresses this in the debates. And given Trump's style of really not caring about formality, how much Trump simply interrupts Biden or interjects and brings up everything that's going on right now with the anti-police sentiment. And Biden will be arguing that he's not pushing against police, but just pushing for racial justice. But all Trump has to do is really just play the card of riots and at least appeal to some voters.
And it's worth noting, it's one thing when Kate Brown or Ted Wheeler or Jay Inslee turned down federal aid. Those states aren't remotely competitive, and there are large portions of those areas that would be in favor of refusing that. It's another thing when Tony Evers, who only narrowly won election in 2018 in a very competitive swing state, refuses aid in a situation that's clearly out of hand. I think some of this to a degree is even worse than what went on in Minneapolis. Because the amount of destruction that went on. Obviously, Minneapolis got hit hard. Some of the photographs coming out of Kenosha are horrifying. Like looks almost like a war zone. I mean, this is just perfect imagery. I mean, on a blunt level to use, but also if you're going to refuse the National Guard coming in to stop that, that's a pretty effective campaign ad, in my opinion, regardless if there's merit to that or not.
It's very, very bad news for Tony Evers, especially if he's running for re-election in a Biden midterm, because if you look at the traditional history of midterms, usually the party opposite of the president or the challenger party does better in midterms. Typically, the House flips and they make gains in the Senate. That's just average. Not always, but it's highly unlikely unless there's a national tragedy or emergency, or in the case of Bill Clinton's impeachment, something that makes a popular president seem like a martyr, that the president's party will do well in the midterms. And with these images coming out right now, I highly doubt voters are going to forget this kind of stuff 2 years from now when Governor Evers is up for re-election. And I think he's going to have a very tough race for re-election.
Yeah. I mean, and obviously, even to a degree, Oregon, they're. I mean, I don't want to sleep too much on them. A Democrat's not won more than like 53% of the vote in Oregon in a couple of decades. Their elections have been relatively close for the last decade. So even there, that's one where you wouldn't want to sleep on necessarily if there's a credible.
No, I mean, if you look at it, Brown only won by 7 points in a blue wave. If there's a red wave, and if the suburbs in a red wave go back to voting Republican, which is possible. I mean, if we look at the history of midterms, it's possible. And just like Democrats had surprising wins in states like Kansas, theoretically, a Republican could win in Oregon if the margins are as close as they were back in 2018. And again, Brown won by 7 points. But Oregon's another example of those states that are definitely, at least recently, more competitive on the state level than they are on the federal level. I
Well,
mean,
even then,
Oregon and
yeah.
Washington still both have at least one Republican row officer, like Kim Wyman is the Secretary of State in Washington.
Mhm. Well, if you combine suburban strength, like the recipe to win either of those states is to combine suburban strength with strength in the timber areas, in the north,
Mhm.
specifically in the northwest of Oregon. Um, that's a way to win. If you, I think I may be off base here, but the 2012 gubernatorial election in Washington, for example, was fairly close. It was within 5 percentage points. If you take the margins that Trump polled in some of those timber counties in the Pacific Northwest areas, all of a sudden the Republican probably wins that race, or at least it's a lot closer.
Yeah,
Um,
it was only 51 to 49 in that race. I
yeah,
mean, back in 2004 when Dana Rossi ran against Christine Gougois, that race was very, very close. Really,
contested.
that is
Yeah,
one of the most
contentious.
controversial races ever. Republicans will argue that Rossi had the election stolen from him, but it was took months to certify,
It was
even
contentious.
longer
Yeah,
than Minnesota Senate 2008. That was
yeah,
one of the longest elections to certify. Literally, I think won by like 0.005% or something.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But seriously, guys, thank you for coming on for the debate. I know we've angered some people in the comments section, but the whole point of this is to be kind of like debate time. And even though all three of us seem to agree, oh well. I mean, it was a good point, and we had some good discussion. So thank you again for coming on, and make sure you watch our Massachusetts election coverage
Mhm.
tomorrow. We're going to be covering a ton of highly anticipated races starting at 8 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow. So come check us out on Elections Daily. Like, subscribe, and thank you for watching the report. As always, we appreciate you watching, and have a good night.